Welcome, everyone. My name is Solimar Salas. I'm the Museum of Latin American Arts Vice President for Museum Content and Programming. We welcome you today to Wednesday, February 17th, 2021, to this edition of MOLA Zoom Project in Conversation with artist Rafa Esparza, where MOLA Chief Curator Gabriela Urtiaga will discuss the artist and his work. We also want to thank the Dwight Stewart Youth Fund, Rumba Foundation, Arts Council for Long Beach, and South California Edison for their constant support of the educational programming at the Museum of Latin American Art. In each chapter, our Chief Curator places the focus on a series of specific artwork, which requires a close inspection and deliberate process of contemplation and exploration, delving into the ideas surrounding the creation of the works, their sources of research and inspiration, in an effort to immerse ourselves in the world of the artists. In Chapter 7 of MOLA Zoom Project, we interview the multidisciplinary artist Rafa Esparza. His work expresses Esparza's interest in history, personal narratives, and kinship, his own relationship to colonization, and the disrupted genealogies that it produces. Using live performance as his main form of inquiry, Esparza utilizes site-specific materiality, memory, and what he calls non-documentation as primary tools to investigate and expose ideologies, power structures, and binary forms of identity that establish narratives, history, and social environments. Rafa Esparza was born in Los Angeles in 1981, where he currently lives and works. Esparza is a recipient of the Rima Hort Mann Foundation Emerging Artist Grants from 2015, California Community Foundation Fellowship for Visual Arts 2014, and Art Matters Foundation Grant in 2014. His solo exhibitions have been held at Mass MoCA, North Adams, Massachusetts in 2019, Art Base, San Antonio, Texas, 2018, Atkinson Gallery, Santa Barbara, California, 2017, Ballroom Marfa, Texas, 2017, Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions, California, 2015, Bowtie Project, Los Angeles, 2015, and Vincent Price Art Museum, Monterey Park, California, 2013. Esparza has performed at art institutions, including Performance Space, New York, and the Ellipse, Washington, D.C. in 2019, Institute of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, 2018, Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles, 2018, the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, 2017, Hammer Museum, Los Angeles in 2016, and Clock Shop, Bowtie Project, Los Angeles, 2014. Selected group shows were held at San Diego Art Institute in California, 2019, Diverse Works, Houston, Texas, 2019, Craft Contemporary, Los Angeles, 2019, Gamma Gallery, Guadalajara, Mexico, 2019, Bemis Center for Contemporary Art, Omaha, Nevada, 2017, Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, 2017, LA Art, California, 2017, Participant Inc., New York, 2016, Hammer Museum, Los Angeles, 2016, Armory Center for the Arts, Pasadena, 2015, and Human Resources in Los Angeles in 2013. With that impressive introduction, I leave with you, Gabriela Urtiaga, MOLA's Chief Curator, who will take it from here and start the discussion.
Thank you, Solimar, for your introduction, and thank you all the MOLA team. Hello, everyone, and welcome to MOLA. I hope you are well and safe, and thank you for joining us today. Hello, Rafa, welcome.
Hola. Good morning.
¿Cómo estás? Good morning.
Estoy bien aquí en el estudio.
So
Tomándome
nice.
mi cafecito.
Qué rico, qué rico. It's a good moment for a coffee, right? And thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for opening up your home to MOLA and our audience. We are so pleased to have you with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Well, how are you doing, Rafa? How are you feeling during these special and challenging times?
I feel like doing my best, like everyone else, to just fare through the moments. We just recently in Los Angeles had like a very high spike of infections during the holiday season. And I think it's just speaking with friends, I know it was maybe like the first moment where a lot of us experience loss due to COVID, and a lot of illness within our communities, within our families. And so, yeah, just kind of like, doing my part to social distance and just to be responsible and be supportive of my family and my community so that we could, come out of this on the other end, hopefully changed, hopefully better, hopefully healthy. But yeah, just kind of hanging in there.
Yeah, it's the same here in LA, in California, and in other countries that we received today from our audience too. And Rafa, to start our conversation, I would like to invite you talking about your creative process, about your beginning and artistic searches, because you introduced to us in your body of work to crucial questions about Latinx representations and identity.
Yeah, and while that remains like a part of my practice and my creative process, it's so informed by, which is really important, the process and the journey as to like how I arrived to these certain like ideas. A lot of my experience, my personal experience really informs how I move through my practice creatively. And so I like to, in some ways, think about my practice as like a cartographical project that charts how I've navigated not only like the physical city that I grew up in, but the institutions that govern cultural production and other systems of power, such as the prison industrial complex. And so I've been making art since I was a child. So my first memories of making art were in the kitchen with my tias and my mother, making little recuerditos for fiestas, whether it be like a baptism or a quinceañera or first communion. They were very, they're creative women that love to make these gatherings more special. And so they really encouraged me to pursue like being a creative person through my childhood. I formalized my relationship to art making, I guess, through academia, I guess, when I started studying at East LA College. A lot of my focus there was just a lot of training in drawing and painting. And after being there for several years, I finally transferred over to UCLA, where I started to experiment with form and with different forms of investigating my relationship to space, my relationship to my own body. And so these are like these kinds of this process or this trajectory and my own personal history again, coming from being a first generation Mexican American, are things that have really informed this process of making art and making sense of images and movements and objects that I make as part of this process.
Yeah. Well, Rafa, and that you said, and during this special time, I know that you are involved in many important and urgent social issues, right? Like the project of La Frontera Nos Cruzó and the Found the Hate for XMAP. Can you explain the purpose of this collaborative activation and how we can support this campaign? Because there are many layers of stories and meanings, correct?
Yes, this is a project that I co-organized with my collaborator, Castles, whom shared this idea of thinking really ambitiously and big about how to reach the masses. And Castles is a performance artist that I've known for over a decade, have always been like a really inspired student and fan of their work. We had worked on a couple of projects prior to this. But so the project is called In Plain Sight. And it was a project that gathered 80 artists, activists, and organizers, as well as a film team, an impact team, and a coalition of 17 immigrant justice organizations to focus our attention on the current crisis of immigrant detention. And so using the large format of skytyping, which is the act of using a fleet of 5 planes that fly parallel with each other in the sky, like emitting puffs of steam out to spell out like the sort of digital text in the sky. A corporate kind of like advertising format. We wanted to use that on the 4th of July. That in the US is also like a very patriotic kind of like form of messaging to the masses. Typically you would see in the sky on the 4th of July, like something like Happy 4th of July or something patriotic written in the sky. And so we wanted to use this format on this day to question what it means to be celebrating independence, right, on this national holiday. And so what we did is we invited, again, these 80 artists to generate messages that would be written in the sky directly over immigrant detention facilities, as well as immigration courthouses, in front of over borders, over historical sites of relevance, places that used to be incarceration camps, for instance. And so over the course of the 4th of July weekend, we flew over these various facilities from Southern California up to New York. And we used it also to, as you could see in the photographs, each message was followed by a hashtag that read XMAP. And XMAP would lead people to our social media, our online platform. We have a website, it's xmap.us, because what we wanted to do is not only just use a sort of like the skytyping as a device to yes, perform this poetic act, but also garner like there's this possibility of being able to reach, just to give you a sense of scale, each message in an urban center could reach up to 3 million people. It's viewable from 20 miles out. So multiplying that times 80, that's the amount of people that who could maybe see these messages. And that's not counting like a robust social media presence that we strategized also with our PR team. So the idea was to harness all of this attention and funnel it to the organizations that have been working towards helping people incarcerated in these places for decades. And so the website became like a very crucial part of this project. We worked alongside our incredible impact team with Lina Srivastava, Rebecca Lichtenfeld, and was led by Seth Hernandez Ronquillo. And they kind of led the forming of this kind of like coalition with these immigrant justice organizations. They were our boots on the ground that were really kind of like helping inform like which centers were important for us to fly over, which, you know, when people think about immigrant detention or immigration, it's an issue that people usually relegate it to the sort of like geographies along the border, right? When in fact, when me and Castles were researching for this project, we learned, and I didn't know this, that there are immigrant detention facilities in every state in the US. And so what you'll also find on our website is a map where if you put in your zip code, it'll geolocate you and those detention facilities around you. They're everywhere. And so a big part of this was to inform people about the current crisis with immigrant detention, which has become increasingly criminalized over the last 2 decades. And to give people a way of taking action, of getting involved, lending their support, whether it be monetarily to support these various bond funds that help people get out of immigrant detention so that they could fight their cases from the outside, or writing a letter to your governor asking them to stop ICE transfers from local jails and prisons into these various detention centers. And so if you actually go onto our website, there's a Take Action tab. And if you scroll down, you'll be able to find like all of these incredible organizations, which I should say is not a comprehensive list of organizations in the country. There are so many other local immigrant justice organizations that are doing incredible work, that need support, that are providing housing for people when they come out of immigrant detention, and providing so many other necessary services. But this is it's a project that's deserving like of a full hour of conversation.
Yeah.
But this is like a kind of like summation of what inspired the project and what were some of the goals that were intended with this massive collaboration.
For sure, Rafa. Thank you for explaining us this inspiring and powerful project, and so necessary in this moment, right? And well, I would like to put the focus in your powerful performances. To start the route, I am interested in BUS from 2019, where you are revisiting the history of violence, and revisiting the power of symbols and architecture in front of the White House in Washington, D.C., correct?
That's correct. Yes. This is a project that was realized collaboratively with 2 organizations, Ballroom Marfa from Marfa, Texas, that I had worked with on a project a couple of years prior to this, and Performance Space New York, an organization that had invited me to envision a new work. And so initially the invitation was to consider doing a work in New York. And I felt like, just in terms of like what was going on in the country, how violently the rhetoric by 45's administration was impacting communities of color, immigrant communities, queer and trans communities. I felt like something like this felt more urgent and necessary. And so these 2 organizations worked with me to manifest this really incredible like 2-day performance that started just behind the White House, where I took an Ayanna column, such as the ones that line the porticos of the White House, and ensconce myself within it, a concrete replica made with my collaborators, Timo Faller and Carlos Agredano, and then transported it to the White House, where I proceeded to chisel my way out of it using a hammer and chisel. And so it was important to kind of like think about this structure, this physical structure that literally supports an architecture that houses, these people in power that are making decisions about the well-being of this country, that again um, during the entire administration was behaving very violently against very vulnerable communities. And so I wanted to kind of perform this action that was very symbolic. I was thinking a lot about the symbolism of this rhetoric, right? And how that impacts like how people think, how people feel about difference, and wanted to create like a counter spectacle to that.
Yeah, and I think is that you decide to do that in a public space is so powerful too, and political action.
Yes, it was important to kind of like do this, to have this proximity to the very architectures of power that I was addressing, to literally bring it to their front door. And for this to be seen by tourists, by people that are there to visit these monuments that are so revered, respected, and to, you know, make present like a different perspective, a critical perspective.
Yeah, for sure. And well, linking with this performance, our next performance is so personal, poetic, and political too. That is Cumbre from 2018, where you are sharing a lot of histories of life, migration, collective memories, like a journey linking with the river, the border, the footprint of body, and which visibilize and questions the system of power, right?
Yes. Should we let this play a little bit before I begin to speak, or do you want me to speak over it?
Maybe we can see the video, right? An introduction.
Okay. Sure.
Thank you.
Go up into the vents and contaminate our collection.
This is the second part, right?
We're also considering zapping
Yes.
them with radiation or pesticides. It's the only way we can have them share space with the rest of the work. The Bracero program. During the Bracero program of 1942, a guest worker program initiated to make up for the physical labor shortage due to World War II. Mexicans were herded through inspection stations like animals and sprayed with DDT, pesticides. Dirt is brown, brown is dirty. We end up settling on an outdoor space, a beautiful space, elevated to a second story. Nothing, no one is sprayed with pesticides or zapped with radiation. Your work is so site-specific. Can you see it functioning outside of Los Angeles? We're concerned about contamination and dust going into the vents that are shared with our private collection. Can we think about another location for your installation? Same logistical concerns, same histories unknown, same bodies disregarded. My initial vision was to use a space in the gallery where a brown rotunda would be built up of adobe and include a small window in the structure that would face west with the view from one of the windows in the upstairs galleries. We decided on the lobby gallery, a space on the floor level, a beautiful space, fully stenched with the smell of LA earth and brown bodies and brown tongues chatting away, bilingual bouncing off the adobe wall and ground. Nothing, no one is sprayed with pesticides or zapped with radiation. Dirt is brown, brown is dirty. A friend told me the other day, PST, LA, LA, this is the beginning of something. Can you feel it? Can you feel it? Pacific Standard Time, Latin America and Latino art in Los Angeles, or rather Latinx art in Los Angeles. They've arrived to the West. They're here. Where do we stand? Defend Boyle Heights has said no. Where do we stand? How do we inherit as we move forward with our work in these institutions, in art spaces? How do we move forward into culture that has ignored and colonized entire continents, cultural production? Are we co-opted? Are we assimilated? Can we turn our backs on art history with a capital A, art history? Can we look towards a history of uniquely evolved cultural production in these colonized lands? What does that recuperation look like? I propose to be dragged by a lowrider car with a queer femme laying on its trunk across the street, across the First Street Bridge from East LA into downtown Los Angeles. The proposal couldn't be proposed. The proposal couldn't be supported because accountability was being taken for historically not being invested in engaging brown communities east of the LA River. Point very well taken. This body holds a lot of memory.
This is incredible, Rafa. And you
Who are
select
you,
different
artist?
elements and symbols to talk about, for example, the water, like an onion, but at the same time, like a wreath, right?
Yes, this performance is something that was very specific, not only to, I feel like Los Angeles, a community that was able to physically attend and be present for it, but also thinking a lot about, as something that I mentioned earlier, how my experience of navigating these traditional art spaces in terms of speaking directly to how we've inherited these ways of producing and exhibiting and experiencing art. But then also like I think the essay that I wrote was like a combination of these personal navigations of being a first gen queer brown person in the US, and my family's history of coming to the US. And so there's like a projection of the Rio Grande that you see in the background, where my father actually first crossed as a teenager, and actually drowned, was saved by his uncle. And then it's like foregrounded by like a homemade water fountain that I use to bathe in. And they're like these elements that you can't really capture, that can't be captured on video. But there's a part where I cut all of my fingerprints. And I don't know if you notice it, but when I'm underneath the water, it changes slightly to red. And so there's like this kind of like bathing in water, and then kind of like bathing in my own blood. And so there are like these water and these objects, like these succulents that are these very resilient desert plants that are kind of like framing this place that I'm speaking from, kind of like grounding this place where I'm speaking from in the desert, along with these like resilient plants. And then you have my sister, Sebastian Hernandez, who's literally kind of like improvising to this text. And so she's a performance artist, has a background in dance as well. And so she's using the sound of the water, using the sound of my voice to kind of like create this movement, responding to it. This very kind of like experimental, kind of like call and response that's happening in the space. And so there are like these ideas of how we hold memory, how those memories like inspire and inform how we participate in creating culture. And it's a literal kind of like, it's very explicit. It speaks to like my experience of working at the Hammer, working at the Whitney Museum, working at MoCA, and the conversations that I'm had about my work, and how against these very rigid protocols, something like Adobe can exist inside a gallery with the rest of the work. It has to exist marginalized, in a lobby gallery or in an outdoor space. And these are objects that are embedded with immigrant labor. I bring up the Bracero program, where people's actual bodies were sprayed with DDT because of fear of them being infected or contaminating someone. And so that these bricks, that these objects are being questioned the same, in a similar way. I wanted to make this connection very clear for people in the audience that may work with these very institutions, but also just making these this is also a piece that's very reflective, that's very like reflecting of those journeys, again, personal, but also as they relate to my artwork. There's a lot in this performance, and I'm grateful that the document exists now, because we could access at least like my writing, which felt like I don't typically recite or read as part of my performance. It's very movement based, very action based, but it felt necessary. I guess that's something that I'm also, as I'm looking at some of these documentations of performances, is something that that I think is important, is this need to, it's important for me to be open to things that are happening in the moment, to be very present, not just in the performance space, but to be present in the world, to really have my feet in the ground and to be open to responding.
Yes, for sure. At the same time, it's an open artwork because we can learn, and you are sharing a lot of experience, knowledge, and histories through this special performance. And Rafa, the next selection of the artwork is Tierra, Sangre, Oro from 2017, an installation when you invite other artists to open the dialogue about the ideas of land, body, and the brown community, right? And you are there in representation of a lot of people, and you are talking about the root of rituals and ceremonies too.
Yeah, so prior to this, I had already kind of like worked with Adobe and was using it using the process that I learned from my father, Ramon Esparza, who was a brickmaker in Mexico before he came up to the States. I learned a lot about the process in terms of it being a labor, a vehicle that could inspire these kind of like experimental collaborations, and as a way to inspire like conversations, dialogue. And so my experience of working at the Whitney and inviting Beatriz Cortez, Amen Origiran, Gala Porras Kim, Ramiro Gomez Jr., and to have them all there, installing their work in this brown kind of like space that we built. It was only like we were able to share space for a few days, and I love that. It kind of like changed everything for me for us to be speaking in Spanish in this place, for my father to be there with us, and to be literally building the discursive site and not just letting our objects speak to one another, but us be speaking together. And so at Ballroom Marfa, I wanted to kind of expand on those few days that we had at the Whitney into months where we could invite some of the artists that I had worked with before, along with new artists, and to use the Adobe differently here. You know, I didn't want to fall into this sort of trap of replacing the white cube with the brown cube. You know, I wanted to really hold on to this sort of experimentation, and to really like kind of like think of other ways that the Adobe could function. And so here the Adobe becomes like a platform for someone's like artwork, a pedestal, walls, literal walls that are built for photographs. Sometimes the Adobe itself becomes a material for someone else's like sculptural like objects. And then the top photograph that we see is me wearing a poncho made by Amen Origiran in collaboration with Taller Gobelinos from Guadalajara. And it was something that he wanted to double as a garment that you could use, but also have it be like a tapete, something that could be used on the ground for you to sit on. And it's part of the series where he is interpreting these Aztec deities. In this case, it's Quetzalcoatl. And it's called Talking Shit with Quetzalcoatl. And so it's literally like using or his interpretations of these deities, these iconographies, and literally using them to create, using them as an opportunity to hold space for conversation. And so his work actually existed folded on like in a miniature version of this altar that you see in the Ballroom Marfa courtyard. And then you could either unfold it and wear it in the gallery, or walk out with it and lay it on this larger kind of like altar. And you could just use it for leisure to sit on it with a group of friends and experience the rest of the work in the courtyard. so yes, this idea of working together with Adobe, being that we had the time to be in Marfa for months at a time, it was incredible to not only share these spaces of where we all evolved our artworks and our ideas, but also live together, share meals on a daily basis, these kind of like very mundane daily rituals that really extended beyond like working with Adobe. I feel like we all got to know each other and each other's work a lot better. And it was like this moment where, for instance, in the project that I made with Beatriz, we built like this portal that was inspired by a Mayan archway, and it's our practices are literally blending into each other's in that moment of collaborating. You can't really decipher which part did Beatriz do, which part did Rafa do, and that's like those moments feel like really generative, for both of us, where we could really kind of like be involved in the sort of in the questioning, in the molding of an idea together.
Yeah, and Rafa, talking about the Brown Cube, the next amazing installation is starting at the Sun from 2019, when you are putting the focus in representation. At the same time, you are talking about art history with a predominant brown material, the adobe, right? Like a leitmotif in your work. Can you explain to us this room and the different section that you decide to present here and in this anti-room that you said?
Sure. So the top photograph is like an installation view of the gallery. But before that, there's a room that was painted all white. The floor was painted white, and there's this instruction to never clean it or sweep it, but to just have it exist as is for the duration of the exhibition, which was up for an entire year. And so what greeted you when you came into this anteroom was the painting that you see on the bottom, which is a painting. I was working from photographs taken by Leonard Nadal that were documenting Mexican braceros that were coming into the US to make up for the labor shortage during World War II. And were sprayed down with a pesticide, with DDT, which has then since then become like obsolete. You can't use it anymore because it's a cancerous material. But so I wanted to, it was important to kind of have this, to think of, to again, make this connection palpable in terms of like my very personal experience of having conversations with institutions of how this material has how it's navigated, how it's moved through these spaces, and literally how bodies experience and encounter a similar violence. And so when you walk into the gallery, what you start to see are like these portraits of family members, chosen and not chosen. This is a portrait of Sebastian Hernandez, who she performed in the piece that we just saw earlier. And I wanted to figure these queer relatives. It was important to put a focus on them, to think of a history of, when I'm thinking about like, yes, representation, because they're like figurative paintings and they're portraits, but also thinking about the frameworks in which our bodies are historically figured, and by whom and for who and how, right? And the how becomes like a very important question. It becomes an opportunity for me to really consider like the canvas, the history of these art materials that, again, we kind of default to oftentimes. And so I want to be very persistent in pointing back to land that is constantly stolen and occupied, where people are still constantly being displaced, and also think about our bodies, and think of like ways to also point back to other histories, to other moments in our histories where there was still like cultural production, and so titling this something like Chalchiutlicue, and pointing to like to an Aztec history as opposed to like a Greek or European one. These things become really important to me in my work when I'm thinking about figuring bodies against an earthen backdrop.
Yeah, and Rafa, I am thinking in Thanks for Staying Alive, and I would like to know how important and influential is your family and your community in your practice?
They've become incredibly important in terms of, again, I would say the first community that I've had outside of my body is my family. And I think there's, for better or for worse, it's where I began where the socialization process begins, right? In terms of how I choose to kind of like invite some of that into my work, it's seminal, really. I mean, I learned how to make adobe directly from my father. I was taught ideas of masculinity directly from my siblings, who are mostly male. And so there are a lot of kind of like foundational senses of being in the world that come from with my family, that I contend with, that I celebrate, that I challenge, that I interrogate. This portrait is of my older brother, Fernando, who was 13 when the picture was taken. And the original photograph is actually, if you could imagine, in this lineup, the last photograph with the blue backdrop, with the blue roses. It's actually like, the original photograph is a photograph of my brother against that backdrop. And so in the 90s, there was in Los Angeles a very popular way of kind of like self-portraiture. A lot of Black and brown youth would take to the malls and take like these, what I call like precursors to the selfie. And it was during a moment there was a lot of gang violence. There was a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric in California, specifically with Governor Pete Wilson. We see a lot of loss due to AIDS, due to gun violence, due to gang violence. The prison industrial complex is taking our relatives, putting them in jail, incarcerating them. So it's this moment where I wanted to kind of remember my brother as a youth that did actually end up having to navigate the prison industrial complex. And so I wanted to also separate this format, this photograph, where I could put my brother against an earthen backdrop, and also use these like whimsical, kind of like glowing backgrounds, like these glowing blue roses, as kind of like maybe like more contemplative spaces, but also place markers for those that never got to maybe take a photograph like this, or those that were lost during the 90s. And so there are a lot of these like moments in my work where that I feel like I've learned and I'm continuing to learn how to trust and to consider how important it is to share like these kind of like personal experiences that are not that aren't necessarily part of the status quo when we talk about like discourse in art, right?
Yeah.
I want to be you know, very mindful when I use these images and when I speak to my family, like what these images mean and what they can mean.
Yeah. Well, Rafa, to finalize this analysis, I would like to talk about building a simulacrum of power from 2014, a performance in a public space. And I would like to know if you can tell us about where you start your research in this kind of work, because through your art and this activation, you are talking about the vast meaning of culture, heritage, rituals, ancestor, and brownness.
So the research is a very embodied investigation. That's how I perceive my performance practice to function. And so this is a maybe a good work to look at in relationship to that, because this is I actually learned how to make adobe bricks from my father in his backyard, outside of the art context. I wanted to learn from him, like what it was like for him to work with Adobe, what it was like for him to build his own house, which he didn't actually get to live in because he ended up coming up to the States before that. And I wanted to learn all of these things in a moment when me and my father weren't really speaking. He was having a challenging time with me being queer. And so we couldn't really share space. But I used it as this, I knew growing up that my father used to make bricks. And I thought this could be a good opportunity to, like, I don't know, have these conversations that I was so yearning for. And instead what happened is that he agreed to teach me how to make the bricks, but we didn't talk at all. And so it was this way of working together, where I start to have this experience of what it is like to mend a relationship, and what it is to speak, to be in communication without verbally communicating with one another. And so this idea of inheritance, and listening, being attuned to you know, what we don't pay attention to when we're speaking, becomes very integral to future Adobe productions and Adobe iterations of Adobe projects. And so here, fast forward to 8 years later, or 6 years later, I invite my father to lead the production of like 1,400 bricks along with my family. We're friends now, we get along. And my father begins to tell me all of these stories of him building his house in Mexico, how he imagined the house would look like, what his family would look like. This is before that he was even like dating my mother. And so this conversation that I was hoping to have years before finally arrives. And it's this oral tradition, this way of, again, listening, and valuing those experiences as information, as knowledge, as education, and and embedding the work with these conversations that I have with my father, with my collaborators, with my peers that are invited into this process. It's really honoring, again, because of the various violences that we experience as people that are displaced, as people that are colonized. The record is always up for speculation, right?
Yeah.
And so where there's gaps in the record, we have these stories that we inherit to kind of like to tell us more.
Yeah, for sure, Rafa. Wow, it's look amazing, and thank you for sharing with us your creative process, your knowledge, and your history story too, right? And well, we are open the Q&A session. Jorge Cibaja, the curatorial assistant, he can read the question from our audience.
Yeah, so if you haven't already, we'll take a few questions. Don't want to keep everyone here too long, but Patrick Frank asks, why was it important for you to wear a business suit while hammering your way out of the column in your performance piece?
Yeah, there was this, there's a lot of symbolism, and I think in any garment, any tool, any like way that I kind of like fashion myself when I perform. And bust is not only the sort of the act of busting out of this column, but there's an image of myself ensconced up into my chest with the concrete that creates this kind of like traditional form of a bust, right? And so I wanted to always think about like what these things mean. A business suit historically is read as something, as like a uniform that imbues power. And I wanted to kind of like mirror that or embody that alongside with work gloves, alongside with these hand tools. And I wanted to consider like, or to complicate this sort of like this uniform of power that kind of delegates, that tells people what to do with a worker, that's usually on the opposite end of that power.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So I think those are all the questions that we have. We went over time, but it was a great conversation. Thank you, Rafa.
Thank you. Thank you, Rafa. Thank you for your generosity with us. It was a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this series. I'm looking forward to other future dialogues with other artists.
Yes.
Thank you, Gabriela, and thank you, Tumola.
Thank you, Rafa. And thank you all of you for joining us today. Our next Zoom project will be on March with Argentinian artist Marta Minujín. Thank you, bye-bye, and stay safe, right?